All right, so you want to really get what went down in the 2024 Russian elections? Well, strap in, because today we're going deep, beyond the spin, past those headlines, to uncover just how fascinating this election really was. And okay, it wasn't exactly a nail-biter, we know that.
It's true. Putin's win, not exactly a shocker, was it? But it's the how, and even more so the why, that make this election worth a good look.
You got it. We're talking about an election where, let's be real, the outcome seemed like a done deal from the start. But as always, it's the details where things get really interesting. So we've got our sources lined up, starting with Wikipedia for the basics. Then we'll get into some seriously insightful analysis from Novaya Gazeta and Meduza. Those guys love digging into the numbers, don't they? And of course, we've got a stack of articles capturing all the reactions from inside Russia and around the world.
It's a goldmine of information.
You said it. So before we get to the main event, the Putin Victory Lap, how about we meet the other folks who actually dared to, step into the ring? Because even when the winner seems like a sure thing, seeing who else threw their hat in tells us a lot about the whole political scene, right?
Absolutely. You see, in Russian presidential elections, even the candidate selection, just that process by itself, is super revealing. It's not just about who's allowed to run, but also who gets shown the door and for what reason.
Ooh, that's a good point. It's like, remember Boris Nadezhdin,
Hmm?
the guy running on that anti-war platform? Talk about David and Goliath.
Indeed. Nadezhdin, he was a former State Duma member from the Civic Initiative Party. He ended up disqualified by the Central Election Commission. They said there were problems with the signature supporting him.
Problems. Come on, that's putting it mildly, isn't it? Makes you wonder, his stance against the war in Ukraine, which, let's be honest, is a pretty brave stance to take in Russia these days. You have to wonder if that played any part in those so-called problems.
Oh, I think a lot of analysts would agree with you there. They saw his disqualification as pure politics, because really, removing him from the ballot, that speaks volumes about how much or how little room there is for dissent these days in Russia.
It's almost like they're saying, hey, you can run for president, sure, but only if you agree with everything we say, no questions asked.
Yeah.
And then there was, what was his name? Sergei Milinkovich, right? He got so close to actually getting on the ballot.
He did. Milinkovich, representing the Communists of Russia Party, he gathered almost every single signature he needed. He was practically knocking on the Kremlin's door.
But not quite making it through, huh? What happened there? Did they find a coffee stain on his nomination papers or something?
You're not going to believe this, but that Central Election Commission, citing, wait for it, irregularities in his signatures, rejected just enough to keep him off the ballot.
Wow, talk about cutting it close. Really makes you think about the tightrope these guys have to walk, doesn't it? Even if you jump through all the hoops, there's no guarantee they'll even let you play the game.
Exactly right. It shows a system where even the appearance of opposition is, well, carefully managed, to say the least.
Okay, so we've got Putin, the incumbent, who might as well have a lifetime membership to the presidency at this point, and a couple of hopefuls who were, let's just say, strongly encouraged not to participate. Who else was left?
Well, there were a few others, but it seemed more like they were there to make the whole thing look legit than to actually challenge the big guy?
Like one of those straight-to-video sequels, the ones that just make you appreciate the original even more.
That's a good way to put it. Like Leonid Slutsky from the Liberal Democratic Party, familiar face in Russian politics, but even before the campaign started, he was predicting a huge victory for Putin.
Not exactly what you'd call a ruthless competitor, is he?
Yeah.
More like he knows who's buttering his bread, right?
Precisely. And then there was Nikolai Kharitonov. He was from the Communist Party, ran against Putin before, actually, back in 2004, so it's not his first rodeo, as they say.
But I'm guessing he wasn't exactly measuring for curtains at the Kremlin, was he?
Not quite. In fact, he went out of his way to avoid criticizing Putin in interviews, even praised his leadership. Not really the move of someone trying to take his job.
More like someone hoping for, I don't know, a nice vacation package or something, maybe?
Perhaps. And finally, we had Vladislav Dovankov. He was from the New People Party. Relatively young compared to the other candidates, tried to present himself as more moderate, even promised peace and negotiations as part of his platform.
Interesting. Sounds like he was trying to appeal to voters who were, let's say, a little tired of the same old, same old.
Possibly, yes. But his campaign didn't really have that energy to be seen as a real threat. Even with that more moderate stance, he was very careful not to directly criticize anyone he was running against.
The delicate dance of Russian political survival, right?
Right.
So where does this leave us? We've got Putin and then a bunch of folks who were either unwilling or unable to put up a real fight.
It all adds up to a picture of a political system where, let's be honest, dissent is getting stifled, real opposition is being pushed aside, and the result is, for all intents and purposes,
Let me guess. Predetermined,
you got it.
which makes what happened on and around Election Day even more fascinating.
Yeah.
Because if we already know how it's going to end, why even bother with the whole election show? All right, so we got the stage set. The players are, well, maybe not so much players as, like, pieces on a chessboard, when it comes to Russian politics. But now it's Election Day. And even though we know the ending, I got a feeling this is going to be one wild ride.
You're not wrong. This wasn't just any election. This was an election where, let's just say, the powers that be had a very firm hand on the scale even before the first vote was cast. And honestly, the lengths they went to, those details are fascinating.
You're telling me. Like, remember all those news stories? Free Ferris wheel rides if you voted, iPhones as incentives. They basically turned Election Day into a game show.
It was certainly a sight to behold. But underneath those, shall we say, creative tactics, there's a calculated strategy at play. Some are even calling it pre-rigging.
Pre-rigging sounds shady as heck. What are we talking about here? Exactly.
So pre-rigging, it's basically manipulating the whole election process before a single vote is even cast. Like of creating this environment where the outcome you want doesn't just seem likely, it seems inevitable.
So less about stuffing ballot boxes, more about kind of, I don't know, nudging or maybe shoving voters towards a result that's already been decided.
Exactly. And one of the most, let's say, interesting examples of this pre-rigging was the decision to hold early voting in, get this, Russian-occupied Ukraine.
Oh, right. I forgot about that. It's one thing to, encourage people to vote, but to bus them to polling stations in a territory everyone knows belongs to another country, that's next level.
It certainly makes you question the whole thing, doesn't it? But even setting aside the occupied territories, within Russia itself, there are all sorts of tactics to, how should I put this, encourage people to participate.
Oh, yeah, those incentives. Free Ferris wheel rides, iPhones. It's like they were giving away prizes. But here's the thing, and maybe it's just me, but it all seems so obvious, so over the top, almost like they weren't even trying to hide it.
Now, that's a very astute observation. And it gets at a possible reason behind all of this. By making those incentives so big, so impossible to ignore, maybe they were trying to create a sense of, well, everyone knows Putin's going to win anyway, so why not get a free Ferris wheel ride out of it?
Right, like, it's a done deal, might as well enjoy the show, but did it work? Did people buy it?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We can't know for sure how much those tactics influenced individual voters, but we do know that according to the official numbers, there was a very, very high turnout.
And a high turnout usually means good things for the person who's already in charge, right? Makes it look like everyone's happy, everyone approves.
Precisely. But, and this is where things get interesting, even with all this pre-rigging, the incentives, those turnout numbers, there were still these, well, whispers that things weren't adding up.
And those whispers, they lead us to
the overseas votes.
Ah, yes, those pesky overseas votes, always mucking up a perfectly crafted narrative. So what happened with those? Okay, so we've got this election, right, where it seems like the outcome was a foregone conclusion, but they're still pulling out all the stops, making sure everything goes according to plan. And then you have these overseas votes coming in from outside that, carefully controlled information bubble.
And those votes told a very different story, didn't they? Even though it was a small number of the total votes, those overseas ballots, they were hugely symbolic.
It's like that saying, you can fool some of the people.
Exactly. You had these unofficial exit polls from places like The Hague, for example, and they were showing Dvankov, the New People candidate, winning by a landslide, complete opposite of what was happening inside Russia, where Putin, big surprise, got a resounding victory.
So outside Russia, where people could see different sides of the story, maybe felt less pressure to go along with the program? Let's just say Putin wasn't exactly getting a standing ovation.
That's one way to put it. And it wasn't just anecdotal either. Two independent Russian media outlets, Novaya Gazeta and Meduza, they did these really deep dives on the election results, the official ones, and let's just say what they found was pretty interesting.
Yeah, those numbers. Something wasn't adding up, was it? Putin winning with 88% of the vote. Even for Russia, that seemed a little optimistic.
Optimistic, you could say that. Novaya Gazeta, they estimated that a whopping 22 million votes for Putin out of his total of 64.7 million non-online votes were probably fake.
Wait, 22 million? That's
Yeah.
not just fudging the numbers a bit, that's like inventing a whole new group of voters.
It is pretty wild. And Medusa, their analysis, they found something called Churov's saw.
Yeah.
It's a statistical pattern that points to fraud, where you see these spikes in both voter turnout and the percentage of votes for Putin. And those spikes happen right at these suspiciously round numbers.
Chirov saw. Sounds like something out of a horror movie, not an election analysis. But what does it actually mean, like in plain English?
So imagine you're looking at a graph, right? A graph of voter turnout. In a fair election, you'd expect to see a pretty smooth curve, generally speaking. But with this Churov's saw, you get these jagged, unnatural-looking spikes at regular intervals, like someone took a saw to the data to hit certain targets.
So less about being sneaky with the manipulation, more about just straight up faking it.
Pretty much. And the thing is, this pattern, it showed up in multiple regions across different groups of voters, which suggests that someone, somewhere, was coordinating this effort to make Putin's numbers bigger.
So let me get this straight. We've got pre-rigging, crazy voter incentives, turnout numbers that are through the roof, and on top of all that, we have what looks like good old-fashioned fraud. It's like they were playing a rigged game and then bragging about how well they were doing at the same time.
That's one way to look at it. It might tell us that it wasn't just about winning, it was about winning big, showing everyone that they're in control, even if in reality things aren't so clear-cut.
And speaking of not so clear-cut, what about how people reacted to this whole thing? Because it wasn't just about what was going on inside Russia, right? This thing had global consequences.
Absolutely. You had Putin's allies towing the line, congratulating him, saying he had this resounding mandate, but the international community, they weren't singing from the same hymn sheet, were they?
Not even close. I was reading this quote from Charles Michel, the European Council president,
Yeah.
and it's chef's kiss, perfect. He congratulates Putin on his landslide victory, but then he adds, no opposition, no freedom, no choice.
Talk about cutting to the chase. And it wasn't just talk. The EU condemned the election, flat out said they wouldn't recognize the results, and they criticized Russia for becoming more and more authoritarian.
So a pretty firm slap on the wrist from the EU. What about other countries? How did they react?
It was pretty much unanimous. The U.S., they came out and said it was obviously not free nor fair, criticized Putin for locking up his opponents and silencing anyone who disagreed with him. Germany called it a pseudo-election, and the U.K., they denounced it as being anything but free and fair.
Sounds like everyone was in agreement. The rest of the world wasn't buying it.
Exactly. And Ukraine, well, for obvious reasons, they weren't too thrilled. Their foreign ministry actually asked international media to stop even calling it an election.
Wow. Yeah, hard to argue with that. So you've got Putin claiming victory at home, the rest of the world calling it a sham, and this big question hanging in the air. What does it all mean? Where does Russia go from here?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, there are no easy answers. But what we do know is this. Putin might have gotten another term, but the cracks are starting to show.
You said it. You've got the war in Ukraine still going on, economic sanctions, more and more people unhappy under the surface. I think it's safe to say that Russian politics, well, it's anyone's guess what happens next.
Absolutely. And that's maybe the biggest takeaway from our deep dive today. Elections, even ones where the outcome seems obvious, they're about way more than just the votes. They're a snapshot in time, showing us the push and pull of power, control, and that deep desire for something more.
So to everyone listening, as we watch this story unfold in Russia, keep asking those tough questions. Don't just accept what you're being told. And never underestimate how important it is to look beneath the surface, find the truth, even when it's buried under layers of, propaganda and carefully crafted illusions. Because sometimes the truth really is stranger and a lot more interesting than fiction.